So
Okay.
there we go. Go ahead, Enid.
Hello. This is Dyslexia Coffee Talk, and I'm Enid, and this is Ashley. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, everybody. We have Emily Hanford with us. We are so excited to have Emily with us. It's been, Emily, the reporting that you've done on our community has blown minds and taken people's breath away. So we're really honored to have you with us today. I'm sorry, I'm looking down at my notes.
It's okay. I'm glad to be here. Hi.
So I kind of wanted to start off and ask you, what drew you to this world? I mean, most of the people that come into dyslexia, there's a reason that, they're touching on reading difficulties and dyslexia, either because they've entered it from a scholastic or a neuroscientist point of view, or like, me specifically, I'm a parent who was brought to this world because of my child. Enid is dyslexic and has a dyslexic child. So I'm really curious, what drew you to this world that we exist in?
That is a really good question. And other people have asked me that too, because there's just kind of curiosity like, wait, you're not a reading researcher. You're not the parent of a struggling reader. You're not dyslexic. You weren't a reading teacher. Why did you become so fascinated by all of these questions about reading and how people learn to do it and how kids are taught? And so the first thing is, it's true. I had no real personal connection. I didn't really know much about dyslexia, though I will say that since I started doing this reporting, I have discovered that there are some people in my family and some people in my neighborhood and people I've known for a long time who have dyslexia in their family. So it's something that, not that people keep it a secret, but it's not necessarily something you would know about people. And many
Mhm.
people do very much keep their reading difficulties secret. And that's been so that's one thing that drew me to this. I'll talk about how I got into it in the first place, but there are a number of things that have kept me going. And one of them has been the number of interviews I've done with adult struggling readers and the story they've told about how it's affected their life and the ways that they've lived with this shame and this secret in many cases. So I think that's one of the things that's so interesting is when you open this up, what you actually realize is it's not uncommon for people to struggle with reading. This is actually, I think, one of the things that I haven't discovered, but it has been sort of a revelation to me, is that in some ways this whole topic has been treated like, oh, okay, well, there are some people who really struggle with reading and we need to do something special with them and we need to identify them and give them an extra help. And we're not dismissing the fact that that is very true. There are definitely some kids who need intense instruction and we need to identify those kids. We need to prevent that from happening. We need to give them the right kind of instruction. But I think what I found along the way, and I haven't even answered your question yet, but what I found along the way in my reporting is that the big problem here is that there's an assumption about reading that seems to be kind of out there in the water among teachers, among the public, among parents, that learning to read is something that shouldn't be that hard for most people. That as long as someone reads to you enough, as long as you have access to books, if you're motivated to read, if you get a little bit of phonics instruction, a good teacher in kindergarten, first grade who cares and who gives you some guidance and some mini lessons and things like that, that it should be fine. It should all come together. And that if kids don't learn to read under the sort of general conditions that we have in schools, either the problem is they weren't read to enough, there was something wrong in their home or their family. Many times they were deprived in some way. Maybe they come from a low income background. They didn't have access to lots of books. Maybe for various reasons, they didn't have people who were reading a lot to them. So it's assumed, well, that's the cause. Or the kid has a disability. There's something wrong with the child. They have a brain that works different, that's wired differently. So they need some other thing that the other kids don't need. And the truth is that what all of this research on reading has revealed is that a lot of people struggle with learning how to read. Some of them have dyslexia. It's all on a continuum, right? So some people really have a severe working memory issues, rapid naming issues, phonological issues in particular, right? Where this stuff is just super hard for them. And it is not going to come to them without a significant amount of good explicit instruction. But the truth is, it's actually a minority of us for whom this reading stuff is easy. Some people take to it really easy. They practically teach themselves. They need a little bit of instruction, but that's the minority of people. So we have this situation where we're teaching reading in a way, in ways that assume something that's going to work for the minority of people, but the majority of people need more. So anyway, I didn't even answer your first question, so I can shut up for a second and answer your question, or you can ask me something else.
Well, no, but thank you for that, because that was so brilliantly put. I mean, truly, that was so summarized so beautifully, because I love the way you said in the end that it's for the minority that it comes easily to, because that, you're right. I think sometimes we get stuck on it's a dyslexia issue or a struggling reader issue. However, yes, that's just perfect. And yeah, we have many questions.
And so I can tell you how I got into this, because
Please
this
do.
is a total surprise. I mean, if I wouldn't have predicted that I would be on this topic. I wouldn't have, in particular, in my career as a journalist, predicted that I would be on one topic now for really what's about 4 years at this point. That's not the way that my career has worked.
Mm.
I've been an education reporter for quite a while. Since I've been a reporter for my whole career. That was sort of an accident. I ended up in a career I love, but was not part of any plan. But that's what happens for a lot of people. But I've actually been covering education full time since 2008. So it's been a while. And mostly I was doing like older people, older high school, college, preparation for college, because what I was really interested in as a reporter are questions about the importance of education for helping people get opportunity in their lives, and sort of the role that education plays when it comes to equity and opportunity in our society. And so I was really looking at that end, the other end of things, right? Because we all know that post-secondary education is super important when it comes to opening up doors for people in their lives. And so I was really interested in those trajectories. Like, how do people get to college, other kinds of post-secondary education? How do they get prepared for that? What are things about where they grow up or the families they grow up in or the kinds of schools they go to that affect that trajectory? And what happened is I got really interested in so-called remedial education in college. So the really shocking number of students who graduate from high school and are sort of told, by virtue of graduating from high school and what we expect in the society, well, you're ready for college. And then they go to college and they're told, many of them, oh, you're not ready. They take a series of tests. They're often unprepared for them, but they're told, oh, well, you need to first basically master some basic stuff that you don't seem to have mastered in order to complete college, right? So they get put in these remedial or developmental classes. And a huge number of people who end up in those classes never finish their degrees. They don't get what they went to post-secondary education for. They get stymied, they get stuck, they never get out. So I was just really curious about that. And I met several, and in fact, I had one really, really long interview with a young woman who was at this point in her early 30s, I think, who told me about growing up with dyslexia. And she grew up in a kind of moderate income family. There was some sort of dysfunction and stress in her family. She didn't get a lot of like attention to her needs, but no one, not in her family, not in her school, no one had identified these problems she had with reading. And she had basically self-diagnosed herself with dyslexia. She had eventually read about it and been like, that's me. But she was really stuck in a remedial English class in college. She's a very, very bright person. She was clear about what she wanted to be a nurse. She knew that about herself. She had to go to the college and get that degree. And she was really stuck. And she happened to have this professor who saw that. She saw the drive in this woman. She saw how bright she was contributing to class, but she really couldn't read very well and she really couldn't spell at all. And her writing was, frankly awful. Like, she admitted it and the teacher was like, wow, she really can't write. How is she going to make it through college? She couldn't get through the various assessments and things that was going to get her out of that remedial class. And basically this professor just went to bat for her. She just went to the department and was like, you know what? We've made some progress. Something's really going on here, but this woman can do it. Like, she can get through college. And so they kind of came up with a way for her to get through this class, even though she could barely do what she needed to do. And she ended up making it through college. And there was this really touching story about this woman who was her professor, had lost track of her, didn't even know if she graduated. And years later, she was recovering from surgery in the hospital and she woke up and there was her student, Sarah, who was taking care of her. And so that was when she was like, you made it. And Sarah was actually at that point getting ready to go work on a master's degree. And so anyway, Sarah,
Wow.
so there's that. And obviously there are anecdotal stories like that move us all the time. But a couple of things about Sarah. Like, one is she did make it, but it took a tremendous amount of grit and persistence and a little bit of luck, right? To find that person. And she didn't have a kind of a background that would sort of absorb or take care of her. Like she was lucky that she got through. And there's a lot of people who don't. And then the other thing that just fascinated me from a purely just kind of, I'm a reporter who's just fascinated by people's stories and just interested in a lot of things, is this what she told me about. I was like, how did you get through high school with that? Because I think she's pretty severely dyslexic. She's like, I really can't read very well at all. Like I just put text in front of me, and she's memorized all the terms and all the things she needs to know to be a good nurse. There's a whole bunch of stuff you need to know, right? There's your known universe. And this is how people, very accomplished people, get through it. Top scientists and mathematicians, they memorize the words they need to know, but take them off into other words, and they're like, oh no. So she got what she needed. She had a sister who was just a little bit like an Irish twin. She was a little bit older than her, and her sister like read everything to her. She had this super great memory. She's like, I got through college basically never opening the textbook. I just memorized everything. I just listened really carefully. I had my own way of taking notes. I could read my own notes. So I just got really fascinated in that. And so that was 5 years ago now. And so it started with, I just was like, okay, so dyslexia, or just generally just learning disabilities. Like there are a lot of kids who have issues with learning and no one's identifying it or helping them. And I think this is contributing to the problem we have with all these people ending up in college without the skills that they need to make it through college. So I got interested in that, and that really just introduced me to people like you. Like I suddenly realized there's this big movement of parents, mostly moms across the country, who are like raising their hand and saying, wait, I did everything right. We read to our kids all the time. I was reading to my baby when he was in my belly. We have tons of books in our house, well-educated, we did everything right. And these are, as you know, mostly upper middle class people, right, who have recognized that there's something wrong, and they go to the school and they say, my kid's not learning to read. And they're told, like, don't worry about it. It'll all work out. Read to him more. We got to find him a good book. And then it does. And so I did that piece several years ago, which was specifically about that, but it was really the dyslexia moms in this country who were like, do you know that this is like a bigger thing? This is just isn't about dyslexia. There's all this stuff about how people learn to read. And the real issue here is that people in schools writ large, with many exceptions, growing exceptions, don't actually understand that much about what skilled reading is, how people learn to do it, and so what's going wrong when kids struggle to learn how to read. So when you're presented with a kid who's just not getting it at all, at the end of the day, some schools have really good special educators and they really know their interventions and they can really help those kids. But a lot of schools can't even do that. Like I've talked to so many people who are reading specialists and special education teachers, and they really were not taught all of the stuff that scientists have figured out over the last few decades about reading, because no one knew how anyone learned to read 50 years ago, 60 years ago. I mean, it's plodding along. People had some good theories. Some of those theories turned out to be kind of right, but no one really knew. But over the last 40 or 50 years, scientists have really figured it out. I mean, they haven't figured out everything. There's tons of things we still need to know, but there's consensus about the basic process of how we learn to read and what we need to know to be able to do that. And there's not a big difference between what a person with dyslexia and a person who doesn't have dyslexia. They all need to learn the same things to become good readers. The kid with dyslexia is just going to have a much harder time learning it and needs more direct instruction to do it. But it's not like there's like this one kind of brain over here and this other kind of brain over here. It's all this big continuum. And just by not really equipping teachers and schools with what they need to know about reading, we're just missing a gigantic segment of the people in that continuum. You've got the lucky ones who either have it's really easy for them to learn how to read, and or their parents are able to, they shouldn't have to, but they're able to, through resources of time and money, figure out a way that those kids can be taught to read, even if they're not learning how to read in school. But then you got everyone else, and that's a
Right.
big number of kids who this
Right.
isn't easy for them, and they got no safety net. There's
No.
Right.
there's no one who's going to write a check for a tutor or a private school, or even the testing that they need to figure out what's going on.
Right. And that's one of the most important things I think about the movement in general is we have to take the advocacy, the kids that are being successful out of those few that can afford the resources and the time and the energy in order to provide that to their children. We have to make the shift in order to reach all of the children. And that's what I liked about your last report was, you called out some of that, some of that inequality in that. I think it was specifically your last one where you said, how much you read to your child doesn't matter. And when you provide structured literacy from the get-go, you truly level the playing field across all socioeconomic statuses. And I was like, finally, somebody said it out loud.
Well, and I have to say, Emily, you're saying a lot of things out loud that people haven't been saying out loud outside of this dyslexia world. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is when you're talking about Sarah, I go into IEPs all the time and advocate for kids. And what you're saying is there are very few schools that get it. I'll be honest. And so, but there are some that are more progressive and moving forward. But when you talk about Sarah, her story is all too common. It is very much a story of many students, whether they come whatever socioeconomic background. And like you said, but mostly when you're at a lower socioeconomic background, you're even more disadvantaged in this realm. And you talked about how she got lucky because she had someone who believed in her. She had, different opportunities. However, you've really done some beautiful work on the whole pipeline to prison topic that really doesn't get talked about enough. Right. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your story, one of the anecdotal stories you have about that, and just a little bit about that, because I think something important to shine light on.
Yeah. And also, if people don't know, so the work that I've done is available as podcast episodes and articles, and they're all at a website called apmreports.org/reading.
We've actually linked them all on our website as well.
Oh,
yes.
Perfect. So
We've been sharing a lot.
The most recent piece that you're referring to came out in August, and it's called "What the Words Say." And actually, it's interesting because we came up with that title, and I started the reporting pre-COVID, and there was sort of a slightly different idea about what that story was going to be, and then COVID hit, and it kind of changed. But what you're referring to is the fact that actually so part of it is that I had all this really great tape from a trip that I had taken to Houston several years ago about this ongoing study where they're trying to identify kids in the juvenile justice system who are struggling with reading and give them intervention. And then they're going to follow these kids for a long time and see really what they're looking for is whether or not if they can teach a kid who is struggling with reading to read in the midst of their introduction to being involved with the criminal justice system, can that change the trajectory in any way? So this is a long-term study, and I'm hoping that there'll be some results at some point that I can report on. But I ended up going back because I suddenly couldn't go anywhere to finish my reporting. I sort of went back to that, and I used that to help frame the story, which was always going to try to be about helping people understand the ways that when we fail to teach kids how to read, it has the biggest impact on kids from low-income families and kids of color. In particular, the reason that it has an impact on kids of color is because kids of color are so much more likely to go to high poverty schools, so much more likely in this country. We segregate children in this country by their family income to an incredible degree, and by race. And even kids of color from moderate income families are much more likely to go to a high poverty school than a white kid from a white kid is to go to a high poverty school. And the problem, of course, at a high poverty school is that you're likely to have many more kids who are struggling with reading, which leads people to the conclusion that poverty is the cause, right? And this is a really complicated thing to disentangle for people. Yes, absolutely. Family income and family educational background do have an impact on reading. If you understand something, if you understand the basics of the science of reading and what scientists have discovered, you can see why that is. because there are these two sort of separate but relate to each other parts of reading that a lot of people don't understand. So one is your language comprehension, not anything about your ability to read text, but what if someone was speaking to you or reading out loud to you, could you understand that? So that has to do with your vocabulary and your understanding of the structure of language and your knowledge, in particular, your background knowledge, right? So language comprehension is a huge part of being able to read, but it's not enough. You can have a kid who's got really great language comprehension ability, but the other key part is your ability to actually read the words, to get the print off the page, your decoding ability. And there's actually more than that goes into your word recognition ability.
Yeah.
And so, when kids come into school and they're sort of weak for various reasons on language comprehension, they just haven't had the access to knowledge and opportunities, that definitely can have an impact on their continued ability to learn how to read. They can learn how to decode words really well, but they may not understand what a lot of those words mean. Of course, the most important thing to understand for all teachers is if you teach kids how to read words, you give them the ability to increase their language and their knowledge. Without the ability to read the words, you're not giving the kid the most powerful thing they have to educate themselves. I mean, there's so much to schooling, but the key thing is reading. And if we could get everyone reading and reading well, you give everyone the ability to educate themselves. You give everyone in some ways the ability, the opportunity, the chance to educate themselves in spite of whatever opportunity might be given to them by their education, right? It's the most important thing. And kids with good language comprehension ability can compensate big time. They can look like good readers for a while.
Oh, yeah.
And they can even compensate, you can have kids who really, they do struggle with the word recognition part, but their superior language comprehension abilities really do keep to boost them along, and they can kind of get through school and do okay. This is the thing that's so amazing. And then you realize this kid really has a hard time recognizing those words though. So anyway, I got off track, but the point is that, in our justice system, in our juvenile justice system, in our adult prison population, we have an extraordinary number of people who are struggling with reading.
We do.
And some of those people are people who have dyslexia or severe dyslexia. No one identified them. No one gave them help. But the common denominator here is they weren't taught how to read. Because if they were taught how to read, even those people who have dyslexia can become pretty good readers. Maybe not great readers. Maybe they're not going to be like really fast and, like people with severe dyslexia, it can be a challenge for your whole life. You don't overcome dyslexia. But if you're taught how to read, you can read. I mean, the truth is it's very complicated in this whole dyslexia thing, right? Because the way you're actually supposed to, the true definition of dyslexia is that you're struggling with reading after you've gotten good instruction. But the problem is we're not giving enough kids good instruction.
Yes.
And so you can't, as one dyslexia researcher said, like if you don't teach kids how to read and write, you can't find the kids with dyslexia. Like it becomes, anyway.
Good point.
So,
Right.
Yeah.
But that's the point, is that we really need to recognize when kids don't learn to read when they're young, they're hampered by it. It holds them back. And some kids have the protection of coming from a family that has resources that either can get them help, or I dare say, I'm not going to minimize at all how absolutely difficult it is if you have a hard time reading, but it potentially has less impact on someone from a higher income family who's just going to have a safety net no matter what, right? But you take a poor Black boy who can't read very well, and that is just a huge liability for him. Absolutely gigantic. It's just a much bigger liability than a wealthy white boy in a suburban school system.
And you had a profound point there too in that podcast about the fact that if you're in a situation where people know you can't read, you'd rather act out and maybe do something where you get attention for doing something, that you shouldn't be doing, rather than attention for not being able to read. And I think sometimes that's how it leads people down that path of doing things they wouldn't normally do, because it's an alternative to getting attention to, the negative attention they're getting when they can't read.
Yeah, as many people have said to me, for some people, it's better to be bad than stupid.
Right.
Yes, thank you and that's such a profound, that was one of the things that there's so many things, every single thing in every podcast you've said stands out. I want to write it down. I want to think about it again. But that really was such an important point that I think we need to talk about, because behaviors come out when students are experiencing that wouldn't normally come out for some of these students. And these are good kids who just went down a bad path because they didn't have, what they needed. I mean, my students, when I work with that are high school students that weren't taught to read, as you're saying, and, they're 17 and 14 and 15, and they still have the same holes they had in second grade. Nobody filled them. And so that's one thing I just keep wanting people to understand, is that the holes don't go away. They don't teach themselves how to read. That doesn't just come to them. And because I work with kids from 7 years old to 17, and the 7-year-olds have the same holes sometimes that the 17-year-olds have. And then the 17-year-olds, like you said, are good language comprehension, whatever they were able to get through. And now they're hitting a wall, and they're not able to, and they're getting frustrated. And then some of them will act out and all that. So yes, and such an important point though to bring up for.
And, 2 points about that, it's sort of obvious to everyone that there's a correlation between behavior problems and reading problems. I mean, most people, in schools or whatever would agree with that, but there's an increasing amount of research that's really suggesting that this is causal. And the cause, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, the reading problems, the learning problems come first. Right. These kids are, there are some exceptions, obviously. There are kids who have real severe emotional issues for other reasons, but you come into school, you're 5, you're 6 years old. What's the sort of primary thing you've got to accomplish in school? You've got to learn how to read. It's all about learning the alphabet and figuring out how to read. And for kids who struggle, they notice pretty quickly. They recognize that they're not getting something that it seems like the other kids are. Now, of course, there are some other kids probably who aren't getting it either, but they're all learn how to hide it even when they're 5 and 6 years old, right?
Oh, yeah.
But so it's really that the learning difficulties are the cause a lot of those behavior problems. So but by the time a kid is, like 12 or 13 and is having severe behavior problems in school, that behavior problem has become the thing that everyone's looking at. That's the big shiny object.
Right.
And no one's kind of looking back at the root cause here. And because there's not enough sophisticated understanding of what you would test for, what you would look for to figure out what are the holes for this kid, how would you then go back and teach this kid? What would you even do about that? That's just not what's going on when a kid's in middle school.
Well, and I think part of it is a slippery slope too. Once you begin to look for the behavior, then everything else justifies the behavior. Child's struggle within the classroom itself is dismissed as being difficult or being lazy, or all of those words that are applied to the child instead of looking at what is the causal factor behind the behavior. Like in our last newsletter, a really powerful mom advocate named Lauren wrote a piece for us called Behaviors Before Dyslexia. And it was a gut-wrenching piece because it was about her own child, of course, and how she had believed everybody talking to her specifically about the behavior, and nobody was looking at the fact that this child could not read at all. And it becomes a devastating slope more than anything else. I mean, I remember specifically it being implied that my son was stupid, a clown, and lazy, when none of those were true. But that's unfortunately happening far too many times within our schools. It's
so devastating for these little kids who are being told that they're lazy and they're not trying hard enough. Yeah. And this reading thing is actually, they're trying so hard. Like they're trying to hide how hard they're trying. They're just really trying hard. And then people are like, you're not trying hard enough. And it's just, it's so frustrating.
Definitely.
It sends such crazy messages to the kid because they don't understand. They keep thinking, I don't know how I can try any harder. Right. And yet they know on some level they should be able to learn how to read because these are bright kids, but they also know on some level that nobody's teaching them. It's a frustrating thing for the kids.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's just this viciously destructive cycle. And if you could look purely at the reading, I think you could break the cycle very quickly and very early on, and prevent the cycle from ever being created at all. But we're in this almost a educational culture, if you will, where the cycle is just repeating over and over again for far too many children across our country.
And of course, it's not, when kids have a hard time learning how to read, it's not necessarily or only resulting in kids acting out. It's they're internalizing it. So kids are getting really anxious, they're getting really stressed, they're getting seriously depressed. I mean, I've said this many times in talks I've given, but just the number of parents who have talked about their small children, 10, 9, 8, 7 years old, who say that they want to die because they can't read. And they're kicking and screaming and they won't get on the school bus and they're being sick and they have a stomach ache and they just don't even want to go to school. And they're perfectly in school. They're not a behavior problem at all. So you have two extremes. You have the kid who's totally acting out. Look at me, I'm the class clown. And then you have the kid who's like, no one even look at me. No one even asked me to do anything. I'm just going to hide. I'm just going to disappear here and hope that I can just keep my head down and get through this whole school thing. But there's 13 years ahead of me, maybe, or more, of this whole school thing. That's a terrifying prospect for a little kid who makes that calculation, like, oh, I don't feel good when I come to school. I got a lot of years left of this. This is what I do every day, all day. It's awful.
And unfortunately that hits home because I have a friend whose 9-year-old attempted suicide. And I have another friend whose child, between the ages of 8 and 10 was self-harming. Where do you have to take a child that is that small to those extremes? But I mean, I can't fathom it, but it's happening. It's happening every day.
Yes.
With your research, where are you going from here? So, I mean, you've done the podcasts that you've done, and the last one was really powerful. You were quoting Dr. Julie Washington and talking about, the inequity within the poor schools, how you can't differentiate those children that are truly just not being given the opportunity versus those children that are struggling with LD. You've shone a light in so many different places. Where are you going from here? If that's something you can even talk about.
Yeah, well, I can talk generally that I continue to be really just interested in the question of sort of why and how it happened. Because I would say, not to be too dramatic about it, but we're in a situation here in 2020 where there's a huge amount known about how reading works and what kids need to learn to be able to read. There's a lot known, but probably less about exactly how to teach it, right? So I think this is something that needs to be acknowledged, is that the translation of all this research to practice is still like a rough road in some cases. Like we don't have all the answers, especially with like, how do you teach a whole class? There's work to be done in sort of translating this into practice, but there's a lot of good work being done. There's a lot of teachers who are doing this translation. There's a lot of, we can teach kids, and it's been shown 25 years ago. It was shown 20 years ago in the studies that the National Institute of Health did, that we can, there are a number of studies that show that you can get 90 to 99% of kids to a decent reading level. No, they're not all necessarily going to score proficient on the NAEP. But could you get everyone up into like the top half, the top 2/3 of the distribution? Yes. Should we have more than 1/3 of kids who are below basic on NAEP? No. We know enough that should not be the case. We really should have very few kids below basic on NAEP. So I think I just continue to pursue a quest. Can you pursue a quest? I continue to be on a quest to understand how it happened. And I've always been really interested in history. Like I'm just really interested in why things are the way they are, where they come from. So one of the reasons this topic is just endlessly fascinating to me is it's really just a history of ideas. Like where did the ideas come from? Right. About how we teach reading? Like when you go into many schools in the United States, you can see commonalities in how kids are being taught, sort of how time is being spent in classrooms, different kinds of routines and activities, the kinds of books that kids are given, the kinds of assessments they're given. And they rest on a set of assumptions about reading that are off in many cases. Right. So how did it happen? And then how do you, what people are now facing is how do you change that? Because this stuff is like, this stuff is so like in the water. Like there are certain ideas about reading and how it works that are just, not to use a pejorative, it's like infected everything. It's almost like a virus, and it's like, and it's not any sort of one's fault I mean, it's certainly not the fault of the educators who this is just the ocean that they were told to go dive into. And they weren't taught what they need to know. So I guess just as a long-winded way of saying I'm still trying to figure out the how and the why. Maybe it'll take the rest of my career. Who knows? I don't know if anyone will keep employing me to do it for the rest of my career, but I feel like I could. I feel like I've just, even within the people that I work with, I'm just like that reporter who's become obsessed with reading. And it's a little bit like, when are you going to stop this and go do something else? I was like, I think I have 10 more ideas of things I need to do. So I don't know.
Well, that brings up Mississippi. We have to talk about Mississippi because when you talk about history and moving forward, you shined light on that and it opened my eyes because I kept thinking, what's going on in Mississippi? How did Mississippi go from the bottom to, I think, the top or close to the top? And so you really did a beautiful piece on that as well. And tell me the titles, because that's the one thing I forget the titles of the pieces, but I've listened and gained the knowledge.
Well, the story about Mississippi was a couple of years ago in the piece Hard Words, which was in
Hard
2018.
Words. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mississippi's fascinating. There are actually some people who are doing some research and really trying to look at that because, this is the other thing that's so complicated about this. Establishing cause and effect in education, super hard, right? So, and that's why even just getting reading instruction right is so hard. There's so many factors. There are a lot of things that affect how well a kid is going to do on a NAEP test or on a third grade reading test. A lot of things, right? So it's very, very complicated. But the story in Mississippi is fascinating and ongoing, and I'd love to go back there in a few years and see how they're doing. They have made some really good strides in NAEP. I mean, they're not at the top yet, but they're growing. And the point is that Mississippi's NAEP scores are getting better, and in a lot of other states, it's staying the same or they're getting worse. They're going down. And so this is the story about Mississippi. And again, cause and effect, really complicated on something like NAEP, a lot of things going on. But Mississippi has really, for the better part of 20 years now, been chipping away at this thing. There are some people in Mississippi who set their sights on this thing a long time ago, and they recognized how many different pieces there are to this puzzle. And it has to do with really getting change at the state level, some policy changes that are like helping them, really investing in teacher knowledge and teacher training, and really investing in the colleges of education, not just in trying to get the teachers themselves being prepared, but a really key and in many cases intractable thing, training the professors and the instructors, the people who teach. Because, and this was the thing that was moving to me about being Mississippi, I think that, one of the reasons we're in this pickle is because there are some ideas about reading that have really gained traction in schools of education and people are not letting go of them. And what they have really discovered in Mississippi is that if you go around to a lot of people who are teaching the basic classes and helping people become teachers, they're not necessarily like the tenured professors who have published a lot of things. They're adjuncts. They're people who are former school principals, former teachers, former superintendents who are coming in and teaching. And they're like, well, we don't know this stuff. We want to know this stuff. Can you teach us this stuff so we can teach it to our students? And so that's what they're investing in Mississippi, which is completely fascinating. So it's like the higher education, the professional development that teachers get, the policy at the state level. I think one of the things looking at like the curriculum that's being used, I don't know that they've done as much on that in Mississippi. That might be a place where they need to do a little more work. So yeah, who knew that we could look to Mississippi? The amazing thing is that if you look at like certain subgroups of kids in Mississippi, what you will see, I'm probably going to get this wrong. I have to go back and look at my notes. But if you look at certain subgroups, you compare, a state like I'm not going to name a state, but poor kids in Mississippi are doing as well or better than a lot of poor kids in other states that you would think, oh, that's not Mississippi. I would think that they were doing much better than that. No. To put it bluntly, poor kids in Mississippi are kicking the ass of like poor kids in a lot of other states. And that's meaningful. If you can get gains among kids from low-income families, that's where you're showing like, oh, that's probably something the schools are doing, right?
Right.
Because it's not necessarily that you go into a lot of these like high performing districts that love the way that they teach reading or whatever. And one thing is they have fewer kids who are going to struggle. They just have more, facing you in a classroom every day are just more kids who are, it's tilting in the odds of this isn't going to be that hard for them to figure out. And however you teach them how to read, fine. And then there's going to be some kids who struggle. And so they show up in those test scores. You go to these affluent, high performing districts and you actually look at their reading scores and you go, why does this district have such a good reputation? 30% of the kids still aren't reading proficiently, but that looks good compared to a lot of other school districts. Oh, 30% aren't reading proficiently. Oh, that's good. 70% are, but why aren't more? And then you realize that, well, there's some segment of those kids, either the ones who aren't reading proficiently or the ones who are, but guess what? Someone's paying like $50 an hour for them to get tutoring 5 days a week or every Saturday, right?
Yep. I'm in one of those affluent leading, districts. I can't remember the other descriptor that you used, but yes, you just described my district to a T.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's, and to what you were saying earlier about, it's almost like a virus is, as an advocate, what I find too is how those poor beliefs seem to truly infect everything else. I do see those balanced literacy beliefs going across such a wide spectrum of things when I'm talking to people and asking questions, and I'm sitting here going, okay, you wouldn't actually think that about this subject over here if you didn't have this deep, profound influence over here telling you that that's the case. So I love that you describe it as a virus, because I think you're spot on with that description, because it really is.
I guess that description is going to make a lot of people mad, however.
Why?
We don't care here.
Well, first of all, we don't want to belittle viruses at the moment.
No,
that's one thing.
By no means. It's an interesting time. Well, one thing I really wanted to bring up about that, though, you reported that before in Mississippi, the public school programs were educating 20 minutes on phonics in a 2-year program before they came in and changed the standards of what they were doing. And before that, you said that you had reported that they didn't even know the five levels of, what they needed to know for teaching reading. And now they're making sure that's happening in college. It's just shocking to me, 20 minutes of phonics. And so I think people don't realize the level that the professors aren't getting the science of reading and the stuff, that's where it needs to start.
Yeah. And it's also, I think part of the problem too, is that now, increasingly people can add phonics, right? They can check that box, they can teach it. And that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean, for example, that's the thing about 20 minutes. That was not me who was reporting it, but that was a study that was done in Mississippi. And no, that's okay. I reported on the results of that study, but the point is that adding a little bit of phonics can mean a lot of different things. And also it's not necessarily enough. So just because you add some phonics doesn't mean that your instruction is really aligned with the science of reading, because it's not all about phonics. In fact, it's not really about phonics. It just happens to be that what scientists have discovered is that the key thing when it comes to reading, really, or one of the key things, a foundational thing, is phonological awareness. You have to understand something about how the sounds in words are represented by letters. It's not the whole shebang, but it's a big part of it. And that's what got kind of dismissed in this most recent era and fads about how to teach reading, was sort of an assumption that wasn't that important, or that would just come to a lot of kids, without recognizing that that's something that a lot of kids come into school and they can learn it, and they need to be taught it to be able to have that kind of phonological phonemic awareness that they need to become good readers. So, I think we're in kind of a pickle now, because what we fought about for so long was phonics. So now, as long as people are like, oh yeah, I'm all for phonics, I got that. Then kind of like, it's almost like anything goes. One question is like, how much phonics and what kind of phonics, and also, do your teachers understand why they're teaching phonics? Do they actually understand the role that plays in reading development? And I think the answer to that is no in a lot of cases. So that's why it's so important, just handing a teacher a phonics program. I mean, also what we know, I mean, teachers still shut their door and do the things that they think is right, that they're familiar with, that are easy to them. And one of the issues here is that teachers themselves, again, not their fault, don't really understand what they need to know about the structure of language to teach it to little kids. Most of us don't know what we need to know about the structure of English language, even if we're good at the English language. It doesn't mean we know what you would need to know to teach it. And people, I tell you, most people who go into teaching early elementary, they didn't think like that they needed to be like masters of written English, or that they had to understand like the cognitive science of reading. And when they're told like, wait, I went in to teach first grade, you're telling me that I have to master all this science of reading stuff and all this stuff about the structure of the English language, like that's not really what I signed up for. Because
Right.
that's not what we've said teaching first grade really is.
Right.
But it is. Like we should actually be teaching our first grade teachers so much more money, and we should be investing so much more in their development. And we should be taking all of our masters of the English language and making them kindergarten, first and second grade
We
teachers.
should.
100%.
It's a brilliant idea. Yeah.
So there's one question that I wanted to ask you is, I know that you don't have a dyslexic child, but after all of this research that you've done, because you do have such a profound audience following you and the things that you're reporting, what would you, if you were a parent falling into this world, and I say falling because Enid has heard me say this many times, as have several people that watch Coffee Talk, is I call my son the White Rabbit, and I'm Alice, and he's pulled me into this wonderland place, you know? So we fall into this world, most of us. We didn't know that it existed. We didn't understand. We've forgotten how we learned how to read because so many years have passed. You know, to us, it's easy at this point for those of us that aren't dyslexic or struggle with reading versus what it is for our children as they begin this journey. If you were a parent falling into this world with your child, where would you, knowing what you know now, what would you tell a parent where to begin, how to start? Where do you go from here?
Well, I think the most important thing that I've learned from parents who've told me their story, some of them are in the midst of it, and some of them, this is sort of a traumatic past that they're telling me about, is like, trust your gut. That's the big thing. Like, so many parents do have a gut level feeling something's wrong, but they're so often told, don't worry about it. And it's really trust your gut. Because again, it's not like it's the end. It's not the end of the world if your child is struggling to read, but you should nip it in the bud. You should get on it, because it really does start to cause problems. And because we know that, you know, reading development is such an exponential process, right? The kids who are getting it are just exponentially sort of increasing their knowledge and their reading ability, and they're learning to read by reading very quickly. And the kids who aren't, and they're missing out. So you have, so it's that Matthew effect, which is the rich get richer. And then there's another part, the poor get poorer, but it's not really that the poor get poorer. It's like that the rich get richer and the poor just keep getting a little bit better in the little fits and starts. And then all this like emotional stuff and all this other, they get like weighted down by all this other stuff. And then they're falling behind in science and math and social studies, and they don't like school. And all these other kids are going up, 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 up. And this is like, you see this, you know, this is the achievement gap that we have. And it's associated with family income and race in this country, because so many things are, because these engines of opportunity and stuff. But anyway, that's a long-winded way to say, no matter who you are, like, trust your gut and decide, like, I got to figure this out. I got to do something about this. I got to go ask more questions. And then I think the thing really is, find the other parents who've been through it before and have them give you the advice. They've either been through it in your school or your school system. So, you know, particularly like you need, because there's like little secrets. Like, you need to talk to that person in the main office. You need to talk to that special ed teacher over there. You know what I mean? Like, people know the little, you got to get this kind of assessment. There's a clinic that gives them for free. You know, like, you have to find the other people who are in this with you, and you have to recognize, and this is my last thing, is that you're not alone. Because most parents think they're alone. They think it's only my kid who's struggling and it's only me who's going through this. And then they start to realize, then you don't realize that there's probably a few other kids in your kid's class who are having the same experience. And maybe some of those parents don't know to the degree that you do. Like, maybe they have that little gut feeling and they've just pushed it away for a long time. But You need to go find those people who have that little gut, and you start talking to them and they'll be like, oh yeah, you're right. Oh yeah, I'm really worried about that, but I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. I don't have time. I get covered in sort of educational gobbledygook edu speak when I talk to the schools, and I just don't know what to do. And so many parents have told, I mean, I just heard from a parent this week, who finally figured this out about her kid, and he's 16, and then like this,
That's
it's
not
like,
uncommon.
yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's actually quite common because so many of these kids are stealth and
Yes.
do have language comprehension and do get by and do kind of not want to be seen until they have. Yeah, it's very unfortunate.
And I actually heard a term before. I was actually reading a kid's psychological evaluation. I had never seen this. You just said it, stealth dyslexia.
Yeah.
Which is the thing. This term was used. I'd never heard that
Right.
before. There's such a thing, stealth dyslexia. And it's really a kid who doesn't really quite exhibit all, doesn't really qualify as dyslexic, but they struggle to read and they hit it. And here they are. They compensated, and they're like, they show up as a stealth dyslexic. And it's basically that dyslexia that poor instruction causes.
Well, and they're usually can memorize thousands of words, like you were mentioning earlier. So that's, it's crazy. That's how they get by.
Yep.
But they have so many of those holes that Enid was talking about with her students, there's pieces that were missing within their education that would enable them to be better readers, but nobody's provided those pieces to them.
Well, now that they're getting,
no, go ahead.
Sorry. I was gonna say, now that they're getting the pieces, they're like, why didn't anyone else teach me this way? It's kind of like the kids in the Texas prison, research project. It starts to make sense, and they're thinking, well, this makes sense. If someone had taught me this way, I would have gotten it. So that's what's so kind of, really tragic, is that these kids get it eventually if they get the proper systematic, explicit instruction. However, they have to go through all the misery first. So yes, go continue.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, reading this kid's report, it's just so sad when you look at the little subtests and things, and you just see like the deep phonological deficits, for example. Like someone could have seen that in him when he was 5, 4. You can test for that stuff. You can get the warning signs early. And so, to see like a teenager who has this profile, and you're just like, look, it's amazing how well he's done.
Right.
Like, look at all the
it's miraculous.
he's had to compensate for. Yeah.
Yeah. And if they don't get it in 4 and 5, you'd hope they get it at 6 and 7 or 8. And then it just stays there, and the frustration or, is there for that long.
Yeah.
Well, we've been on for about an hour, so we don't want to take up any more of your Saturday.
Well, that's okay.
But this has been
a pleasure talking to you.
Awesome. Well, we so appreciate you coming on. And
there's nowhere to go. There's nothing to do. It's
right.
It's sunny though. I'll go take a walk. I either sit here at my computer, or I take a walk, or I eat and sit on the couch with my family. What else can you do?
I know. I want to bring up one thing you did talk about that made me kind of chuckle, was the electric company in the 70s that we actually had. We had electric company, and we had, what was the one with conjunction junction? Was that electric company where they taught you all the, but
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock. Thank you. So we had Schoolhouse Rock, and we had electric company. And those were things that built language skills in kids. That was fun. And we learned things, and, there's definitely a lacking of that today, but
yeah. And I was, back when we all had a kind of, not that everyone watched Sesame Street, but a common experience. Now there's like, our worlds are so all over the place, but there were like a lot of kids watch Sesame Street. And again, it's not like that was going to teach kids who have difficulty to read. But when I look back, I don't really trust people who tell me with a certainty how they learn to read, because I don't know that people can really remember that well unless it was really documented at the time. So I don't really know how I learned to read. I think I was one of those kids who it wasn't that difficult for. However, I mean, I watched a lot of Sesame Street and Electric Company and Schoolhouse Rock, and my parents bought me decodable books. I remember them. I had them at home.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things help. And so now that we don't have Schoolhouse Rock and Electric Company and those things, we do, but it's very much want to encourage parents that just communicating, talking, playing with language, making language fun, all aspects of language actually builds these skills that these Electric Company, Schoolhouse Rock used to help us build. So there's many resources out there, but I think just making language fun, and that's what those programs did.
Well, I wish somebody would update Schoolhouse Rock because I played Conjunction Junction over the summer for my 11-year-old, and he shot me daggers through the whole
Yeah.
thing. Just
They don't
kidding.
appreciate it.
Why are you torturing me, Mom?
Yeah. It's true. There needs to be a 2020 version. It's not the
Right?
same aesthetic.
But it probably needs to be Japanese anime with some,
Yeah.
action and, stuff
Right.
like that. But yes.
Get on that, Ashley. Yeah.
Sure, I'll add it to my list.
Well, yes, it was truly a pleasure talking with you today.
Yeah, thank you so
Definitely.
much for having me. Yes.
Thank you so much. And as a reminder to everybody who's watching, we've got our website, dyslexiainitiative.org. We have our YouTube channel where we will upload this video, as well as to our Dyslexia Coffee Talk podcast as well. Don't forget to subscribe to those, as well as to our website where we release our free quarterly newsletter. The next one's due roughly around January 15th, so be on the lookout for that. But
And all of Emily Hanford's podcasts will be posted today as well.
yes, and we have a link to all of her podcasts on our website as well under For Parents. So we try to give you an introduction to falling into this world, as I said earlier. So all of Emily's podcasts are linked there. So thank you again, Emily, so much for taking time to speak with us today. This has been amazing. So we really appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Have a great weekend.
You
You
too.
too. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.